There was a man who once believed that thought was nothing more than a whisper inside the skull, powerless against the hard walls of circumstance, until the day he discovered that the very walls he thought were solid had been built, brick, by his own mind, without his ever realizing he held the trowel. That discovery did not come from a mystic, or a dreamer, or someone speaking in riddles. It came from a Scottish judge, a man trained in the strictest kind of logic, someone who spent his life weighing evidence and demanding proof before he would accept anything as true. His name was Thomas Troward, and what he found when he turned that same disciplined mind toward the inner world of thought changed the way countless people afterward understood their own lives. What you're about to hear is not a dry recitation of old ideas. It is an invitation into a way of seeing yourself that once understood cannot be fully unseen, because it touches the quiet suspicion so many of us carry, the sense that there is more going on beneath the surface of our daily thinking than we have ever been taught to notice. Troward did not set out to write anything mystical. He set out to ask a very practical question. If mind has any power over matter at all, even a small amount, does that power operate under fixed and knowable laws, the way gravity or electricity does? Or is it random, unpredictable, available to some, and closed off to others by accident of birth? His answer, delivered originally as a series of talks in the town of Edinburgh to a room full of ordinary listeners, was that mind operates by law, consistent and impartial, and that once a person understands that law, they are no longer at the mercy of chance. This is the heart of what became known as the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, sometimes referred to by the name of the hall where they were given. And it remains one of the most quietly influential works on the relationship between thought and life ever put into words. Before we go further, let's sit with why this matters, because it is easy to hear the word law and feel your attention drift, as though we are about to enter a courtroom of dusty statutes. But think for a moment about what it actually means to live without understanding a law that governs your life. A child who does not understand gravity does not stop being affected by it. She simply falls without knowing why and blames the ground, or her own clumsiness, or bad luck. Once she understands that objects fall because of a consistent, describable force, she does not become immune to falling, but she gains the ability to work with the law instead of being blindly subject to it. She learns to balance, to catch herself, to build things that stand upright. Troward's claim, stated plainly and without embellishment, was that most of us are living exactly like that child, but with our thoughts. We are shaped by an inner law we have never been introduced to, and so our lives feel like a series of accidents, good luck and bad luck, when in fact, something far more orderly is happening underneath. In the opening movement of his teaching, which we might think of as the first chapter of this journey, Troward begins by drawing a distinction that sounds simple at first and becomes more startling the longer you turn it over. He says that mind operates on two levels within us. There is the part of your mind you are using right now. As you listen to these words, the part that reasons, chooses, argues, decides, notices. He calls this the objective mind, because it deals with the outer world, with objects, with facts that can be examined and debated. And then there is another part of mind, working quietly underneath the surface of your attention, which he calls the subjective mind. This is the part that keeps your heart beating without your supervision, that digests your food, that heals a cut on your hand while you are busy thinking about something else entirely, that remembers the smell of a childhood kitchen the instant you catch a similar scent decades later. This subjective layer of mind does not argue. It does not debate. It simply accepts what is impressed upon it and gets to work making it real. Here is where the idea begins to take on weight. Troward argued that your subjective mind treats every strong, repeated thought the same way your stomach treats food, absorbing it, working with it, and eventually producing an outcome shaped by what it was given. If you hand your stomach something nourishing, it builds strength. If you hand it something rotten, it produces sickness. Your stomach does not sit in judgment over whether the food deserves to become part of you. It simply processes what arrives. Troward's radical suggestion, and the idea that runs like a steady current through every lecture he gave, is that your subjective mind works the same way with the thoughts and beliefs you feed it day after day, especially the ones repeated with feeling. It does not ask whether the thought is good for you. It does not pause to consider whether you really meant it, or whether you were just venting, or joking, or being dramatic in a moment of frustration. It receives the impression, and it begins quietly and patiently to produce a condition in your life that matches it. Think about a man who tells himself, almost as a throwaway line, that he is the kind of person nothing ever works out for. Maybe he says it after missing a train, or losing a promotion, half laughing as he says it, the way people do when they are trying to make peace with disappointment through humor. He does not intend it as a serious declaration, but according to Troward's understanding of the subjective mind, intention in that objective, joking sense is almost beside the point. What matters is the repetition and the emotional charge behind the words. Say a thing enough times, with enough feeling, whether that feeling is bitter humor, resignation, or genuine belief, and the subjective mind treats it as instruction. It does not distinguish between a joke told 100 times and a conviction held sincerely. Both leave grooves. And once the groove is deep enough, the outer life begins to arrange itself to match the inner impression, not because some external force is punishing the man, but because his own perception, his own choices, his own subtle expectations, begin filtering reality through that lens, causing him to notice the failures and discount the successes, to hesitate at the moment that would have made the difference, to give up half a step before the breakthrough would have come. This is not, Troward is careful to insist, some vague sentiment about the power of positive thinking, the kind of thing printed on a poster with a sunrise on it. He wanted his listeners to understand it as something closer to a mechanism, a working system, the same way electricity is a working system, whether or not you like the wiring in your house. He believed, and argued at length with the kind of precision you would expect from a judge, that the universe itself is built on a foundational layer of intelligence, something he refers to as universal mind, and that our individual minds are not separate from this universal mind but are, in a very real sense, individualized expressions of it, the way a single wave is not separate from the ocean, even though it has its own shape and motion for a while. If that is true, then our subjective mind is not simply a private machine locked inside our own skull, cut off from everything else. It is our personal doorway into that same universal creative intelligence that shapes galaxies and grows oak trees from acorns without needing to be told how. Now, before this begins to sound like abstract philosophy floating far away from your actual Tuesday afternoon, let's bring it back down into a story, because Troward himself loved to use ordinary, almost mundane illustrations to carry ideas that could otherwise feel too large to hold. Picture a gardener who plants a row of seeds in the spring. She does not stand over the soil, straining with effort, trying to force the seeds to grow through sheer willpower. She does not dig them up every few days to check whether they are working hard enough. She plants them, she waters them, she gives them light, and then she trusts a process she did not invent and does not fully understand. A process that has been quietly running underneath the surface of the earth since long before she was born. The seed knows how to become a plant. It is not confused about its purpose. It does not doubt itself. It simply follows the law of its own nature, and the growth happens, slow at first, invisible, and then suddenly visible, pushing up through the soil at exactly the moment it is ready. Troward's suggestion is that your subjective mind functions very much like that soil, and your thoughts function very much like seeds. If you plant a thought of lack, of fear, of unworthiness, and water it daily with attention and emotion, it will grow into a corresponding condition in your life, not overnight, but with the same quiet persistence as a seed pushing through dark earth. And if you plant a thought of capability, of possibility, of genuine expectation that things can improve, and you give it the same consistent attention, it will grow as well, following the same law, because the law itself does not play favorites. It is not moral in the sense of rewarding good people and punishing bad ones. It is more like gravity, or the tide, indifferent to our personal opinions, faithfully producing whatever is planted. This raises an obvious and uncomfortable question, one that Troward anticipated his listeners would ask, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it. If this law is so consistent, why do so many kind, hard-working, well-meaning people struggle for years without their circumstances improving, while some people who seem careless or even unkind appear to prosper without effort? Troward's answer is layered, and it is one of the more nuanced parts of his teaching, often missed by people who only encounter a simplified version of these ideas. He points out, first, that we are rarely aware of the full content of our own subjective impressions. A person can hold a sincere, conscious desire for success on the surface of their objective mind, while underneath, in the subjective layer, there sits an older, quieter conviction, planted years earlier, perhaps in childhood, that they do not deserve good things, or that wanting more than others is selfish, or that safety lies in staying small. The conscious wish and the subconscious conviction pull in opposite directions, like two people rowing the same boat facing different ways. And the boat, more often than not, follows the stronger and more persistent pull, which is usually the older, deeper, more emotionally reinforced one. This is where Troward's teaching becomes genuinely useful rather than simply interesting, because it suggests that the work of changing your life is not primarily about forcing yourself to think happy thoughts through gritted teeth. It is about becoming honest enough with yourself to notice what has actually been planted in that deeper soil, often without your permission, often placed there by people who meant well, or by experiences you did not choose. A child scolded repeatedly for asking questions may grow into an adult who unconsciously associates curiosity with danger, even while consciously believing themselves to be open-minded. A young person raised in a household where money was discussed only with anxiety and tension may carry, deep in the subjective layer, an association between money and fear, an association that quietly sabotages opportunities decades later, long after the household itself is a distant memory. Troward's method does not ask you to pretend these old impressions do not exist. It asks you to recognize them clearly, without shame. The way a doctor examines a wound, not to make you feel bad about having been injured, but so the wound can actually be treated instead of hidden under a bandage of false positivity. And here we arrive at one of the most striking parts of the lectures, the part that gives this teaching its lasting power, because Troward does not leave us stranded with a diagnosis and no remedy. He offers a specific, describable approach to reshaping the subjective mind, an approach he insists is not magic, not superstition, but the disciplined and repeated use of a mental faculty every person already possesses, whether they have ever noticed it or not. He calls this faculty constructive imagination, and it is worth pausing on that phrase, because it is not the same as idle daydreaming or wishful fantasy. Constructive imagination, as Troward describes it, is the deliberate, calm, repeated holding of a mental picture of the condition you wish to experience, held not with strain or desperate grasping, but with the same quiet confidence a gardener has when she plants a seed, trusting the law to do what the law naturally does. If you're enjoying this audiobook, please like and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It helps the channel grow and allows more timeless books to reach more people, and honestly, we get to keep bringing these forgotten treasures back into the light, one voice, one story, one quiet evening at a time. Now let's step back into the world of Thomas. Next is where his teaching stops being theory and starts becoming something you can actually feel taking shape in your own chest as you listen. Troward gives a memorable example in his lectures, describing how a person struggling with poverty or lack should not spend their mental energy dwelling on the poverty itself, replaying the lack, rehearsing the fear, because doing so, according to the law of the subjective mind, only plants more seeds of lack, deepening the very groove they are trying to climb out of. Instead, he suggests holding a calm, steady inner picture of sufficiency, of ease, of things working out, not through frantic repetition or anxious effort, but through a settled, almost restful conviction, the way you feel settled and restful about the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow. You do not lie awake at night straining to make the sun come up. You simply know it will, without tension, without doubt, and that quality of calm knowing, Troward argues, is exactly the quality the subjective mind responds to most powerfully, far more than frantic, desperate wishing ever could. This distinction matters enormously, and it is one of the places where people who have only heard a simplified second-hand version of these ideas tend to go astray. There is a world of difference between desperately wanting something because you feel its absence like a wound, and calmly expecting something because you have quietly decided, on a settled inner level, that it belongs to you. Desperation, Troward would say, actually reinforces the subjective impression of lack, because the emotional charge behind desperation is fear, and fear is itself a seed, a powerful one, that grows exactly the conditions it dreads. This is why so many people who chase success with white-knuckled anxiety often find it slipping further away the harder they grip, while people who develop a settled, almost playful confidence seem to draw good things toward them with what looks from the outside like effortless luck, but is, according to this teaching, simply the natural harvest of a different kind of planting. Let's put a human face on this, because ideas like these live and breathe far more vividly inside a story than inside a definition. Imagine a young musician, talented but overlooked, playing in small venues to half-empty rooms, watching other performers with less obvious skill rise faster, get noticed sooner, land the bigger stages. It would be easy, and understandable, for this musician to spend her evenings replaying the unfairness, rehearsing the disappointment, feeding the subjective mind a steady diet of being overlooked, being unlucky, being someone the world simply passes by. And if she continued that inner rehearsal for years, the law Troward describes suggests her outer life would continue to confirm it, not out of cruelty, but out of simple consistency. The way a river continues to carve the same channel it has always carved, deepening the path with every year that passes. But suppose instead, at some point in her frustration, she encountered an idea like this one, and something in her shifted, not into denial of her current circumstances, because Troward never asks anyone to pretend the present moment is other than it is, but into a new relationship with her own inner picture. Suppose she began, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, to hold a settled mental image of herself performing with confidence, of rooms responding warmly, of opportunity arriving in whatever form it chose to arrive. And she held this image not with clenched desperation but with the calm, steady patience of someone waiting for water to boil, certain it will happen, unconcerned about the exact minute. Over months, perhaps without her even noticing the shift at first, her posture on stage might change, her willingness to speak to the right person after a show might change, her openness to unexpected opportunities might change. Small outward differences that were really the visible edge of an invisible inward change. The seed finally pushing up through the soil after all that quiet germination beneath the surface. Troward would be quick to remind us that this is not a promise of instant transformation. And it is worth being honest about that, because teachings like this sometimes get flattened into simplistic guarantees that do a disservice to the real depth of the ideas. He compares the process to the growth of an oak from an acorn, and anyone who has ever planted a tree knows that oaks do not sprint. They take their time, sending roots down before they send branches up, doing invisible work before any visible work appears. Troward's lectures repeatedly emphasize patience, not as a passive, resigned kind of waiting, but as an active, confident kind of waiting. The waiting of someone who has done the planting correctly and trusts the law to do the rest, rather than the anxious waiting of someone who plants a seed and then digs it up every day to see if it has grown yet, disturbing the very process they are hoping to encourage. There is another dimension to Troward's teaching that deserves careful attention, because it protects this whole framework from becoming a kind of selfish, isolated pursuit of personal gain. He insists, repeatedly and firmly, that because all individual minds are expressions of one universal mind, the law can never be used in a way that genuinely harms another person and produces lasting good for the one using it. This is not a moral rule imposed from outside, the way a judge might impose a sentence. It is, in his view, a structural feature of how the whole system works. If your subjective mind is connected to the same universal source as everyone else's, then a thought held with the intention of taking something away from another person, or diminishing them, is really a thought aimed at the very source you yourself depend on, and it cannot help but produce disturbance and eventual loss in the one who holds it, the way poisoning a shed eventually poisons the person who poisoned it too. This is why Troward's approach to mental science is never framed as a technique for defeating rivals or manipulating others. It is framed again and again as a process of aligning your own inner life more fully with a universal generosity that has no interest in scarcity, because the universal mind, as he describes it, is not limited the way our small, fearful, objective minds often imagine it to be. This point deserves a story too, because abstract reassurance about universal generosity can sound thin without something to anchor it. Consider two neighboring shopkeepers on the same street, each selling similar goods, each watching the other's storefront with a kind of wary attention that shopkeepers everywhere seem to develop. One of them begins to resent the other's success, quietly hoping for the other's failure, rehearsing thoughts of the other shop closing, feeling a small flicker of satisfaction on the days the other's foot traffic looks thin. According to Troward's framework, this shopkeeper is not simply being unkind, he is planting seeds of scarcity and hostility in his own subjective mind, seeds that will not remain neatly confined to his feelings about his neighbor, but will color his entire outlook, making him more anxious, more guarded, more likely to see customers as scarce resources to be fought over, rather than as an abundant flow that could include both shops thriving at once. The second shopkeeper, by contrast, might genuinely wish her neighbor well, might feel a kind of quiet confidence that there is enough business, enough opportunity, enough good fortune to go around. Not because she is naive about competition, but because she has internalized a different, more spacious picture of how abundance actually works. Troward's claim is that the second shopkeeper, over time, tends to build a more resilient, more genuinely prosperous inner life, not because good thoughts magically deposit money into a till, but because a mind unclenched by resentment and fear makes better decisions, notices more opportunities, treats customers with more warmth, and generally moves through the world in a way that a mind constricted by scarcity and rivalry simply cannot match. Let's slow down and talk about something Troward returns to with real tenderness. Because for all his logical precision, there is a surprising warmth running underneath these lectures. The warmth of a man who genuinely wanted his listeners to stop suffering unnecessarily. He speaks about worry, and specifically about the way worry masquerades as responsibility. So many of us have been taught, without anyone ever saying it outright, that worrying about a problem is a form of caring about it, that if we stopped worrying, we would somehow be neglecting our duty, being careless, tempting fate by not being anxious enough. Troward challenges this directly. He points out that worry, examined honestly, is simply the repeated, emotionally charged rehearsal of an unwanted outcome, which means that according to the very law he has been describing, worry is one of the most efficient possible ways to plant exactly the seeds you least want to see grow. The parent who cannot stop imagining disaster befalling their child is not protecting that child through vigilance. From the perspective of mental science, they are unintentionally cultivating an inner atmosphere of fear that colors everything, including, ironically, their ability to respond wisely and calmly if an actual difficulty ever arose. This does not mean Troward asks us to ignore real dangers. He draws a careful line between practical foresight, considering possibilities and taking sensible precautions, and worry, which involves emotionally rehearsing disaster over and over, without any accompanying useful action. A person can lock their doors at night as a simple, calm precaution without lying awake picturing intruders. A person can save money sensibly for the future without spending every evening consumed by anxious pictures of destitution. The difference is not in the practical action taken, which might look identical from the outside, but in the emotional and imaginative quality of the inner life accompanying that action. And it is this inequality, Troward insists, that the subjective mind actually responds to, not the outer behavior alone. Deeply relieving in this idea, if you let it land fully. So many of us carry a quiet, low-grade guilt about not worrying enough, as though ease and peace of mind were forms of irresponsibility. Troward offers something like permission, though he would probably resist that word, preferring instead to call it simply an accurate understanding of how the mind actually works. Peace of mind, in his framework, is not a luxury reserved for people whose lives have already worked out. It is closer to a tool, one of the most practical tools available, because a peaceful mind plants better seeds than an anxious one, produces clearer thinking, notices opportunities an anxious mind is too clouded to see, and responds to genuine emergencies with far more competence than a mind already exhausted from years of rehearsing imaginary ones. Troward also spends considerable time on the subject of healing, because in his era, and in the broader movement his lectures became associated with, there was enormous interest in the relationship between mental states and physical health. He was careful here too, never claiming that thought alone replaces the need for sound medical care, and it is worth being clear about that, because his ideas have sometimes been stretched by later interpreters into claims he himself did not make. What he does argue is that the body, like the outer circumstances of a life, is deeply responsive to the subjective mind, and that chronic fear, chronic self-condemnation, chronic pictures of weakness and decline held over years, tend to produce physical conditions that mirror those inner pictures, not through any mysterious punishment, but through the same steady, lawful process by which a seed grows into the kind of plant it was always going to become. He tells the story, in his own words during the lectures, of how a shift in a person's fundamental self-concept, moving from seeing themselves as fundamentally weak or flawed, towards seeing themselves as connected to an unlimited source of life and renewal, often coincided with genuine improvements in physical vitality. Improvements he attributes not to magic, but to the removal of a kind of chronic inner static that had been interfering with the body's own natural intelligence. An intelligence every bit as capable, in his view, as the intelligence that heals a cut on your hand without needing your conscious supervision. This brings us to one of the most quietly beautiful parts of Troward's whole teaching, a section where his careful, judge-like precision gives way to something closer to reverence. He describes the moment when a person truly begins to grasp that they are not a small, isolated, struggling fragment cut off from the universe, fighting alone against indifferent circumstances, but are instead an individualized expression of the same intelligence that arranges the stars in their courses and knows, without needing to be taught, how to turn a single cell into a living, breathing human being over the span of 9 quiet months. He suggests that once this realization settles into a person, not merely as an intellectual idea, but as a felt, lived conviction, something in their relationship to life fundamentally changes. Fear does not vanish overnight, and Troward never promises that it does, but fear begins to lose its absolute grip, because the person underneath the fear has begun to sense that they are not actually alone in the way they once assumed, that there is a vast, patient, endlessly creative intelligence available to them at every moment, not as a distant force to be begged and appeased, but as the very ground of their own being, closer than their own breath. Let's pause here and sit with an image, because Troward himself, of drawing pictures with words rather than simply stacking arguments. Picture someone standing at the edge of the ocean at night, listening to waves they cannot fully see, feeling small against that vast dark water. And yet, if that person reached down and cupped a handful of that same water in their palms, they would be holding something made of exactly the same substance as the entire ocean, no different in kind, only in quantity. Is that this is something like the relationship between an individual mind and a universal mind. You are not separate from the great intelligence that runs through everything. You are a measure of it, held for a while in the particular shape of your own life, your own thoughts, your own choices, and everything that intelligence can do at the largest scale, it can also do through you, at whatever scale your life currently occupies. Because the water in your cupped hands is still, in its essential nature, exactly the same as the water stretching out into darkness beyond where your eyes can see. This is not, Troward insists, an invitation to arrogance, to imagine yourself as some kind of miniature god demanding the universe bend entirely to your personal whims. It is instead an invitation to responsibility, a much more sobering and in some ways more demanding idea than simple wish fulfillment. If your thoughts genuinely participate in a creative process this significant, then the way you think about yourself, about others, about the very possibility of goodness in the world, becomes something closer to a sacred trust than a private hobby. He asks his listeners, gently but firmly, to consider what kind of world they are quietly building through their habitual inner pictures, whether they are contributing, moment by moment, thought by thought, to an atmosphere of fear and scarcity and suspicion, or to an atmosphere of trust, generosity, and expectant good, understanding that these atmospheres are not simply personal moods but active seeds, taking root not only in their own individual circumstances but rippling outward into the shared human experience in ways too subtle to trace precisely, yet real nonetheless. There is a particular passage in the lectures where Troward addresses those who have grown weary, who feel they have tried everything, prayed every prayer, repeated every affirmation, and still find themselves stuck in the same painful patterns year after year. And it is worth spending real time here, because this weariness is something almost everyone listening, at some point, that exhausted sense of having done the work and still not seeing the harvest. Troward's response is not to scold this weariness or suggest the person simply is not trying hard enough, a response that would only add more strain to an already strained situation. Instead, he gently suggests that trying, in the sense of forceful, anxious striving, may itself be part of the obstacle. He returns again to the image of the gardener, pointing out that no amount of pulling on a stem will make a plant grow faster, and in fact, pulling on the stem is more likely to damage the roots than to hurry the growth along. What actually helps a plant grow is not force applied to the visible stem, but conditions provided to the invisible roots, sunlight, water, patience, and a kind of trust that the plant knows how to do its own growing if simply given what it needs. Applied to a human life, this suggests that the deepest work is not frantic affirmation repeated through gritted teeth, hoping to overpower years of contrary belief through sheer volume of positive words, but rather a quieter, patient tending of the actual roots, which often means looking honestly at where the old contrary beliefs came from, extending some compassion toward the frightened or wounded younger self who first planted them. And then, from that place of understanding rather than frustration, gently and consistently offering the subjective mind a new, calm, believable picture, one small and true enough to actually take root, rather than one so grandiose and disconnected from present reality that no part of the mind can genuinely accept it. Troward suggests that a modest, believable improvement held with quiet conviction will do more real work than an enormous, unbelievable leap held with desperate hope, because the subjective mind, remember, is not moved by the size of the wish, but by the depth of the calm, repeated conviction behind it. This is perhaps a good moment to speak about something Troward calls the personal factor, an idea that quietly but firmly places responsibility back into the hands of the individual, without tipping over into blame. He observes that the universal mind, vast and creative as it is, does not act as an independent agent choosing on your behalf what your life should look like. It acts, in his description, more like an obedient and endlessly patient servant, faithfully producing whatever pattern is impressed upon it by the individual mind connected to it, much the way electricity, vast and powerful as it is, does not decide on its own to light a room or run a motor, but faithfully follows whatever circuit has been built for it to travel through. This means, Troward argues, that the shape of your life is not something happening to you from the outside, decided by fate or luck, or forces entirely beyond your influence, but is far more intimately connected to the circuits your own habitual thinking has built over years, sometimes without your ever realizing you were building anything at all. This idea can sting a little when first encountered, and it is worth being honest about that sting rather than smoothing it over. It can feel, at first hearing, like being told that every difficulty in your life is somehow your own fault, and that is not quite what Troward means, nor is it a fair reading of his intent. He is careful to distinguish between blame, which looks backward with judgment, and responsibility, which looks forward with possibility. A person struck by genuine misfortune, an accident, an illness, a loss entirely outside their control, is not being condemned by Troward's teaching as having somehow deserved it through faulty thinking, and it would be a cruel distortion of his ideas to suggest otherwise. What he is offering instead is something quite different, and in many ways more hopeful, the idea that regardless of how any particular circumstance arose, the way forward from this moment onward remains genuinely within reach, because the same law that can produce difficulty through habitual fear can, with patience and honest inner work, produce renewal through habitual trust. The past cannot be rewritten, but the seeds being planted from this moment forward are, in a very real sense, still entirely up to you. And that is not a burden so much as it is, when you really let it settle, an extraordinary kind of freedom. Troward closes his lectures, in their original form, with a call not toward passivity but toward what he describes as intelligent cooperation with a law that is already working, whether we notice it or not. The way a sailor does not create the wind, but learns to set the sails in a way that allows the wind to carry the ship exactly where it needs to go. He does not ask his listeners to become passive dreamers, waiting for the universe to hand them a life they never had to build. He asks them to become intelligent participants, aware of the creative power moving through their own habitual thought, aware of the responsibility that awareness brings, and aware too of the deep, steady support available to anyone willing to align themselves honestly and patiently with a law that has never once, in the whole history of the universe, failed to produce exactly what was faithfully planted within it. As we come toward the close of this telling, it is worth returning to that image from the very beginning. The judge who once believed thought was nothing more than a private whisper, powerless against the solid walls of the world. By the end of his own inquiry, Troward had come to see those walls very differently, not as fixed and immovable structures imposed on us from the outside, but as living expressions of an inner architecture we are, often unknowingly, building every single day through the quality and consistency of our thought. This is not a comfortable idea in every sense, because it removes the excuse of pure helplessness. But it is, underneath that initial discomfort, one of the most genuinely hopeful ideas a person can encounter, because it means the walls that once felt permanent are not permanent at all. They can be reshaped, slowly, patiently, the way a river reshapes stone not through violent force, but through steady, consistent, calm persistence. One thought, one quiet inner picture, one small act of trust at a time. If this story stayed with you, explore the audiobook library and discover more books waiting for you. Quiet old volumes filled with exactly this kind of wisdom, patiently waiting, the way seeds wait in dark soil, for someone willing to listen. And if you take only one thing from these lectures into the rest of your evening, let it be this: that the mind you carry with you everywhere you go is not a passive mirror, simply reflecting a world already fixed and finished, but something closer to a garden, tended daily, whether you realize it or not, and that from this very moment, with whatever quiet, patient thought you choose to plant next, a new and different kind of harvest has already, gently, begun.